Okie doke. So welcome to our class on the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington National Cemetery. Jerry was a sentinel and an assistant relief commander at the tomb from April 82 to September 83. He was awarded the Guard Tomb of the Unknown Soldier Identification Badge 259. And I'm hoping when you get started, Jerry, you're going to explain what that means.
Yes, I will.
So
in great detail.
Yeah, I know. So thank you for joining us. And he's going to share his experiences and the responsibilities and the history. Bit of housekeeping. Feel free to ask questions when you have them. But when you're not asking a question, please stay muted. And I think that's about it. So we're going to hand it over to Jerry.
Ready to go? Okay. Well, Linda, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thank you all for inviting me to come out. And you already did the biography, so I'm going to skip that. Okay, you went over the.
That's up to you. You've got a lot more there than I said.
Oh, it's you got the highlights, so that's fine.
Okay.
So I want to thank you all for allowing an old tomb guard to continue the mission of remembering the unknowns. And the best thing about it is I didn't have to shine my shoes and press my uniform to do it. I just had to come in my little room here and turn on the computer. So it's a win-win for everybody. And we already talked to Gloria, mentioned that she had visited the tomb. This is for Zoom classes. This is more of a rhetorical question, but I do like to know from my live classes how many people have actually been there. And hopefully, and I know it's not convenient so much for y'all out there in California, but if hopefully this will inspire you to maybe look into it a little bit more, maybe plan a trip out to DC. It's a beautiful city with a lot to do. So today we're gonna talk about the unknowns and the sentinels. First, I'm going to give you an overview of the tomb area and the layout, and actually it's the picture right above my shoulder there, right there. The layout, everything that's out there. Then we'll talk about each of the unknowns: the First World War, World War II, Korean, Vietnam unknowns, and the selection process, and the awards and honors that they were presented with. We'll talk a little bit about the sarcophagus and the grave information. The sarcophagus, again, it's the big white marble thing. Then we'll go into the sentinels. We'll talk about why we guard the unknowns, the history of the sentinels, the routine they do while they're on post, the requirements to become one, some of the training. I'll explain some of the training. Then we'll do a little inside baseball behind the scenes, kind of a day in the life of what it's like to be a sentinel. But the thing I really like to do in this class is to connect dots, connect historical dots, where there's one thing that happened and then several years later or decades later, something else happened that fell in line, and there's just a fascinating trail of things that connect together. So without further ado, we will get into our discussion here. This is the layout of the tomb. This is the sarcophagus. And we are looking, our back is towards Washington, D.C. So we are looking actually north. And you can see, where's my little, there it is. Here's the sentinel on the mat, okay? Now, a lot of people think that's the front of the tomb, but it's not. This is the front of the tomb. It's the front relief. The sentinel walks on the reverse of the tomb. And we'll talk about all of that in much more detail. The thing I want to point out first is this building is called the trophy room. And on the first floor down here are awards, decorations, mementos that have been presented to the unknown. Not all of them, but most of them, a lot of the significant ones. Also on display are the flags that covered their caskets and the Medal of Honor that each of them was awarded the Medal of Honor, and their Medal of Honor is on display there. It's a great trip through history. Last time I was in there, it was closed for a while for renovation. They do have a little thing about the sentinels to kind of inform people about the sentinels. The second floor is an area that, and I haven't been able to find out why, it's called the Hall of Heroes, and it is not open to the public. And it's just, as a sentinel, we used to be able to go up there. It's this beautiful room that has replicas of the Medal of Honor. So the Medal of Honor itself when it is struck by the U.S. Mint specifically for the recipient. So the front is just the regular medal, but on the reverse of the medal is the recipient's name and the date of the action that they were awarded the medal for. These do not have that name and date on there, so that's why they're technically replicas. There's a replica of each of the branches of the military's Medal of Honor. The Army has their own version. The Air Force has one. The Navy, now the Marines are technically come under the Secretary of the Navy. So any Marine awarded the Medal of Honor is given the Navy Medal of Honor. I would imagine the Space Force will probably have to come up with one eventually. There's that. And then on the other three walls, there are brass plaques with the name of every Medal of Honor recipient in America's history. And it's just an incredibly moving, touching room. And I wish they would open it to the public. I don't know why they don't. The other thing I want to point out, you can see the steps here that kind of forms an amphitheater for the tourists to observe the guard change and the sentinel walking. But this is a functional area too. So below the trophy room and underneath these wings right here, and there's an identical one over on this side. Basically under these first two rows of steps, that's where the sentinels' quarters are. That's where the sentinels stay while they are on duty. Now, when they're off duty, they are billeted at Fort Myer, which is right next to Arlington National Cemetery. Or if they're married and have family, the Army gives them money to pay rent, and they would live off post in an apartment or a house or something. But this is where the quarters there's a bunk room for them to sleep at night because they're working a 24-hour shift. So you never get to sleep, but there is a bunk room. There's a day room with a TV and a pool table that never get used because we're busy working. There is an area we call the ready room. And in the ready room, they've got a big, massive like dining room table. And that's where the sentinels work on their uniform while they're not actually on post. So you might be shining your brass, touching up your brass. You might be shining your shoes. And so that's the area. And in the ready room, there is a mirror that goes from floor to ceiling and the whole length. The next time I go down there, I got to take a picture of this to throw in here. But the newly assigned sentinels that are in training, that's where they spend their day. They literally stand in front of that mirror and they practice their manual of arms, taking the weapon from right shoulder to left shoulder, back to right shoulder, present arms, all of that. And that's what they're doing when they're not actually performing other duties that they're assigned. So you spend a lot of time. Now, the mirror is also used as the sentinel's getting dressed to check his uniform and make sure everything looks right and to practice the manual a little bit. So it's a very functional area. This is an overhead view this is called the plaza. Okay, and you can see here's the sarcophagus, and here are the graves of the World War II, Vietnam, and Korean unknown. And we'll talk about why these are flush to the ground as opposed to the way the First World War unknown is. The green thing over here, we just call it the box. It's a place for the sentinel, primarily used when there are ceremonies going on post. If there is somebody on post who is authorized, then the sentinel will post himself in the box and stay there while it's going on. The other time is from 6 in the morning to 7 in the morning. The cemetery workers come out and blow all the leaves and debris, everything. So the sentinel goes in there while they're taking care of that. And also during wreath ceremonies. Speaking of wreath ceremonies, so this metal thing is very hard to figure out what it is. It's actually a wreath stand. So and we'll talk about in detail about wreath ceremonies, but there's about 2,000 wreath ceremonies a year at the tomb. And that's where they place the wreath. And then say and obviously there has to be more than one most days because there's 2,000 every year. They'll take the wreath off of here and they'll place it on the plaza down here until the end of the day, and then they're discarded. The mat, the reason there's a mat out there is all of this is marble and it's very slick. And the sentinels have metal cleats on the bottom of their shoes to keep them from wearing. And it's very, very slippy. And it's very, very likely that a sentinel would slip and fall. So they put this mat out here and you can actually see where it's worn. Here's where the relief commander stands during the guard change. here's the one side of the post, here's the other, and that's where they stand at the end of their thing. And again, I'll go into a lot of detail about the Sentinel's routine. The mat is replaced at 0600 hours every Memorial Day. The old mats are taken off to the inside the amphitheater in an underground, they call it the catacombs area, and they're used then to help train new sentinels in an area that's not available to the public. Let me see here. Oh, also in the box, they do have a phone or a walkie-talkie. It's changed back and forth, so the sentinel can call downstairs. If there is a problem, the sentinel can go in there, call downstairs, tell the sentinels, hey, I need some help up here. There's something going on. So they do have some backup security up there. So why is there an unknown soldier? During the First World War, a British chaplain named David Ralton noted how many unidentified deceased remain, how many graves that had unknown soldier, because they couldn't identify who it was. And part of this, well, most of this is because of the advances in technology in warfare. The First World War saw the advent of the Maxim machine guns by the Germans. And the rounds for those are a half an inch thick. They're a half an inch high, and they just mutilated bodies. The result of that was the trench warfare that First World War has become so kind of known for, is the whole trench warfare tactic. To overcome the trench warfare, what they started doing for tactics was that before you would lead an assault into the bad guys, you would do a massive artillery barrage, thousands and thousands of rounds that would rain down into the trenches. Number one, it keeps the bad guys' heads down while you're advancing, but also to kill and maim. And, it's obvious that artillery rounds are going to cause a lot of damage. And then the next step from that, the answer it was the answer to both the machine gun and artillery, was the invention of the tank. And the tank by itself created, a whole other thing. Now, what had happened here was that previous to the First World War, they didn't have dog tags and IDs and names on their uniforms. Everybody knew who everybody was, but it just the volume of the casualties, they just couldn't keep up. So consequently, Chaplain Ralton determined and went to a friend of his who was a member of the British Parliament and said, we have to remember these soldiers who died and we don't even know who they are. And his quote was that they gave, not only did they give their lives for God, for king and country, but they gave their identities. And we need to remember this. We need to honor that. So they came up with the idea of having one representative unknown warrior. They call it the unknown warrior. And I love that term, and I'll explain why in a second. And to inter them in Westminster Abbey. And coincidentally, and I always refer to the ceremonies there, he's interred right in the middle of the aisle. And in fact, during some of the ceremonies for Queen Elizabeth, you could see them having to circumvent around the unknown's grave right in the middle of the aisle. They also collaborated with the French, and the French did the same thing. They identified an unknown soldier, and he is interred under the Arc de Triomphe in the center of Paris. Let me backtrack here just a little bit. So the unknown warrior, I like that because for us, it could have been a soldier. And if you ask anybody in the military, a soldier while a soldier technically is any military person, it's generally referred to as somebody in the Army. And I assure you that people in the Air Force don't like being called soldier. People in the Navy don't like being called soldier. And I can promise you Marines do not like being called soldier. They take great offense to that. And so I like this term because we had Army, we had Marines, and there were actually some Navy. The Marines use Navy medics, and they assign them to Marine units. So it's very possible that the unknown is a corpsman, is a Navy corpsman. So anyway, I think the term warrior is much more inclusive and much more descriptive than unknown soldier, and that's just my 2 cents. So it's I think it's a much better term. And so and I'm going to connect some dots to that term in a little while here. The other thing I like to point out here is that on the French unknown's grave is an eternal frame. Now, you may or may not know that Jackie Kennedy, her maiden name was Bouvier. She was very French and very proud of her heritage. And this is where she got the inspiration for the eternal flame on President Kennedy's gravesite, was from the unknown soldier. So I just find that. There were simultaneous interments on what we now call Veterans Day. Back then it was called Armistice Day, November 11th of 1920. So not to be outdone, the Americans decided, well, we need to honor and establish an unknown. And probably more so important because they did not repatriate remains back to the United States, especially the unknowns. Who do you take? There's no family. You don't know who the family is. So they decided they'd take one representative of all the unknowns and inter them at Arlington National Cemetery and give them a place of honor. Blackjack Pershing personally selected Sergeant Edward F. Younger to make the selection. And what they did was they went to each of the four major U.S. cemeteries, and they exhumed one set of remains from each of them that were unidentified. They opened the casket and they to do several things. One, to ensure, first and foremost, it was truly unidentifiable. Second, that the casualty was due to war and battle, rather than, and you may be familiar because it's become much more popular. The Spanish flu killed almost as many military people during the First World War as battle did. So I wanted to make sure it was actually a battle casualty. So those were the main things that they did. Then they placed each of the sets of remains into identical shipping crates. And the general in charge of the whole mission even went to the point of on the shipping crate, he identified exactly where each screw would go to hold the top onto the shipping crate. The idea here being that we wouldn't even know which of the four cemeteries the unknown came from once selected. So all of the remains were taken to the City Hall in Chalon-sur-Marne. And my French is terrible. I'm sorry. I do the best I can. I hope I'm close. Chalon-sur-Marne at City Hall, where Sergeant Younger was given a spray of white roses and instructed to place those roses, that spray of roses, on the set of remains he wanted to be designated as the First World War unknown. And in Sergeant Younger's memoirs, he writes about how he walked around these caskets. You can kind of see him. This is the best picture I could find. Kind of see him right here. He walked around all four sets of remains 3 times. And he said every time he walked around, there was one set of remains that he felt some sort of connection to, some inspiration. Like he may have known this person. He may have fought with this person, maybe had a beer with them or whatever. And so he decided to select that set of remains as the unknown. The 3 unselected unknowns were taken back to the military cemetery and reinterred together at Mousargan. The name escaped me for a second there. Taken back to Mousargan, and they are actually in a slightly separate area on their own. I've seen pictures of it. And well, I'll get into that in a minute. So from here, the unknown's remains were taken to a port in France, and they were placed aboard the USS Olympus, and that's another name you're going to hear a little later on, the USS Olympus, and transported back to the United States. And there's some harrowing stories about the trip where they ran into some really terrible weather. The Marines that were assigned to provide a guard of honor for the unknown actually lashed themselves to the deck rather than go below deck to seek safety. So it was quite an experience. The remains were transported up the Potomac River to Washington, D.C., and taken via caisson to the Capitol, where the unknown received a full state funeral, similar to the exact same funeral that a president would receive. And I'm losing my train. I'm sorry. And he lay in state for 2 days there. It's the exact same funeral that a president would receive. Here you can see Warren Harding, the president, laying a wreath. And I read an account of the lying in state not too long ago, and they said it was very, very emotional. There were a lot of people that were completely overcome and had to be helped out, had to be carried out with due to grief. That there were many women, you know, that for all they knew, this was their son, this was their husband, this was their brother. It was an incredibly emotional experience, apparently. One of the cool things about this is the presidential catafalque. This is the same catafalque that Garfield and Lincoln all lay on after they were assassinated in office during their state funeral. And this is another dot we'll have to connect in a couple of minutes. We'll talk about that. From here, the remains were placed on a caisson and transported to Arlington National Cemetery. Now, today, a caisson is considered a traditional military honor that is given to higher ranking officers and that kind of thing. Back then, that's how they really did it. There really weren't any horses. There really weren't any hearses back then in 1921. So it was it was just how they did it back then. Transported to Arlington National Cemetery, where there were full military honors at the graveside. And there's a couple fascinating stories about the graveside service here. The one that always gives me goosebumps is while in Europe, they had people go around and collect up soil samples from each of the major battlefields that the American Expeditionary Forces fought in. And they put them in a barrel and they transported them back to the United States with the unknown. And they placed this soil on the bottom of his grave. So the unknown's casket is resting on 2 inches of the French soil that he fought and died for, and that his brothers fought and died for. And that always kind of goes. They came up with some really, really incredible ideas as far as how to memorialize all of this. The other thing is that the president acts as the next of kin, and he awarded the unknown the Medal of Honor. I'd alluded to that earlier. But he also acts as the next of kin. At a military funeral, the next of kin receive the folded flag. They are a key part of the whole thing. Well, because we don't know who this is, we don't know their next of kin. So on behalf of the American people, President Harding acted as the next of kin. The bottom down here, you'll notice that it was November 11th, 1921. So we just had the centennial, and we had big plans. There was a big commemoration going on. And unfortunately, due to COVID, they had to scale it back tremendously to the point where, like, even former Sentinels, we were not guaranteed access to the ceremonies. They kept it very, very limited, which was unfortunate, but so be it. So I had plans, I had it all set up, and at the last minute we had to cancel. So we'll talk about the selection of the World War II unknown. This proved to be a little more complicated because we had 2 theaters of war. We had the Pacific Theater and the European Theater, but the process was very similar. In the European Theater, again, they went around to the different national cemeteries and exhumed one set of remains. They brought them, again, they inspected them to make sure that they were battle casualty and they were, in fact, not identifiable. Army Major General Edward O'Neill made the final selection of those 13 caskets for an unknown to represent the European theater. Similarly, in the Pacific Theater, 6 caskets were selected, inspected. Colonel Glenn Eagleston selected one of those 6 caskets to represent the Pacific Theater. They were both transported to off the coast of Virginia on the USS Canberra. And here you can see a picture of the deck of the Canberra. The remains were placed into identical caskets. The caskets were placed in a room on the ship, and there were 3 different individuals who were instructed to go into the room individually, one at a time, and they were allowed to either switch the position of the 2 caskets or leave the caskets in the position they're in. And they were sworn to absolute secrecy. They were never to tell anybody what they did. The idea here is so that we don't even know if it's the European or the Pacific theater unknown that ultimately ends up being selected to be the World War II unknown. So they were placed out on the deck. And here we see hospitalman's mate, first class, William Charette, who was the last active duty Medal of Honor recipient in the Navy at the time. He placed a wreath on one of the two caskets and to designate that as the World War II unknown. The other set of remains was buried at sea with full military honors. Now, you notice that there's 3 caskets out here, and we'll talk about that now. I'm sort of surmising that the one in the middle is probably the Korean unknown, and we'll talk about why this is all happening together in a second. So, Charette placed the wreath on there, and they buried the non-selectee at sea. While all of this was going on, in Hawaii, Master Sergeant Ned Lyle, they had exhumed 4 sets of unknown remains from the Korean conflict. Master Sergeant Ned Lyle similarly placed a wreath on one set of remains. Those remains were transported along with the Pacific Theater unknown to the Canberra. Once they had all this settled, these are the unknowns, they were transported up the Potomac River to Washington, D.C. They were transported to the Capitol, where they lie in state. They received a full state funeral. But remember, I talked about we have the presidential catafalque. Well, here we have a dilemma. We've got 2 sets of remains. So what did they do? And again, I found this to be incredibly ingenious. They built a second catafalque identical to the presidential catafalque. When the remains were brought in, the World War II unknown was placed on the actual presidential catafalque. And now I don't know which one is which here. I'm just surmising that it's probably this way. So if this is the World War II unknown on the presidential catafalque, the Korean unknown was placed on the mock-up. And you can see up here by the dates, May 28th to May 30, it was 48 hours. So exactly 24 hours into the laying in state process, 2 casket teams are what the military calls pallbearers, came into the Capitol building, came into the rotunda, secured the remains, and switched them. The World War II unknown was placed on the mock-up, and the Korean unknown was placed on the actual presidential catafalque. The reason World War II got to go first is technically he outranks the Korean because he gave his life first. So in the order of precedence, he gets to go first. And I thought that was just a fascinating way for them to resolve the conflict here with the presidential catafalque. Similarly, from here, the remains were placed upon caissons, 2 identical caissons, transported to Arlington Cemetery, and given a double interment at the tomb. And I'll point out here, so here you can see the box. It's probably a different green cover, but it's the same box. And here you can see the sentinel standing at it. So, but why was there a double interment? Well, the World War II unknown legislation and funding was passed in late 1948, I'm pretty sure it was, 49. And as they were making the plans, and I'll discuss a little more detail shortly, why it took so long to come up with a final plan of how they were going to do this. And it was several years. Well, all of a sudden, now we got North Korea invading South Korea, and we got American troops going to fight the Korean conflict. Everything came to a screeching halt. There was not going to be any unknown interment while all that was going on. Korean War ends. Well, technically, it's still legally going on, but there was a ceasefire signed, and then they decided, well, let's just identify and honor a Korean War unknown at the same time. So that's a lot of the reason why it took till 1958 for this to happen, and why it's a double interment. Again, now President Eisenhower, president at the time, awarded them acted as next of kin, awarded them the Medal of Honor. I always found this very fitting that there's a very good chance that World War II unknown fought under him on D-Day. And so I think that's just a great tribute to President Eisenhower. So one of the reasons, well, I'll talk about that. So let's get to the Vietnam unknown. And the rest of the stuff I read and learned about, this I actually remember. I was a Sentinel from 82 to 83, and the rumblings and the murmurs were starting. We're going to get a Vietnam unknown. In fact, the crypt was already in place when I was there. It was just empty. There was huge political pressure on the Reagan administration to identify and honor a Vietnam unknown. The complication here, to give it some context, World War I, the best number I could come up with was 17,000 unidentified sets of remains, just Americans. Okay. From the Vietnam War conflict, there were four sets of remains that met the criteria. And in fact, the account that I read said that there was one set of remains that they weren't even sure was really an American, a legit American. So technically three. So rather than having an anonymous selection process, they designated one set of remains, and Marine Corps Sergeant Major Alan Kellogg placed a wreath on that, symbolically identifying that as the Vietnam unknown. And similarly to his comrades, was transported to Washington, D.C. Lyon State, received a state funeral. Lyon State at the Capitol, transported by caisson to Arlington Cemetery, where he was given full military honors. President Reagan acted as next of kin. I was in Korea when this finally transpired, and I was just sick. I couldn't get back home. I had only been there a couple of months, but I desperately wanted to get back and see this and witness this. But I followed it very, very closely. But it was absolutely fascinating. Again, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, and I forget if I mentioned, but the World War II and Korean unknowns were also awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, you may think this is the end of this story, like it's been with the other three. But no, like Paul Harvey says, you're going to learn the rest of the story. A gentleman named Ted Sampley, who had been a Special Forces soldier, a Green Beret, in Vietnam, did 4 tours, received 4 Bronze Star medals. This guy was a stud. He wasn't a wimp. He wasn't this guy was a true warrior. And he was very instrumental in organizing Rolling Thunder, which was this annual motorcycle ride on Memorial Day to remember the POWs and MIAs from Vietnam. And they would ride all the way through DC. They would go to the Pentagon and all the way around. It was a big deal. But he was also, and I've labeled him as a provocative activist for the identification and the return of POWs and MIAs from Vietnam, because that's the big number out of Vietnam, are the missing in action where there were never any remains, and the POWs who have never been accounted for. Provocative activists, that was the nicest way I could. This guy was a jerk. He would literally go in to bureaucrats' office, into the Pentagon, and demand that they go find these remains. And he was relentless, and he made a lot of enemies, but he was adamant that he wanted them to go find all of these missing soldiers. He started digging into the Vietnam unknown, and he started now with the unknowns. They list all of the stuff that was with him. There was a parachute. There was this and that, and things like that were actually that were recovered with the remains. He went down the list of all of the MIAs and started checking off. Okay, could have been this guy. No, he had a parachute, so it wasn't this guy. This is the kind of parachute. He started checking off boxes and checking dots, and he figured out who the Vietnam unknown was. Wow. And he wrote an article and posted it in the Veterans Dispatch. He talked to the family of this individual. Initially, they were resistant. They didn't want to be involved, but he finally talked them into it, and it turned into a huge battle, a huge fight. The Pentagon obviously wanted nothing to do with this. They were not going to disinter the Vietnam unknown. They finally got Congress, and Congress ordered them to disinter and do DNA testing on the Vietnam unknown to see if it really was this individual that Ted Sampley suspected it was. So on May 14th, 1998, the Vietnam unknown was disinterred, transported to Walter Reed Army Medical Center. DNA testing was performed, and he was positively identified as First Lieutenant Michael J. Blassie from the United States Air Force. So I'm going to connect a couple dots here for you. Remember I said I like unknown warrior, because Lieutenant Blassie is an airman. He's not a soldier. So that's where I like the whole concept of a warrior. He was I kind of lost my train of thought. So his remains were returned to the family and transported to Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in Missouri. And here's his headstone. And interestingly, so we have the front of his headstone with the dates of action. The reverse on something like this would show all of his decorations: Silver Star, Flying Cross, Purple Heart, Air Medal, killed in action. And he is identified. He is the unknown soldier from May of 1984 to May of 1998. Interesting. Now, it's not quite the end of the story. Remember, I said that the Vietnam unknown was awarded the Medal of Honor. Well, the family petitioned the Pentagon to have that Medal of Honor changed over to Blassie's name. The problem with that is that well, I'm sorry. The reason this is a problem is because there's a lot of perks and benefits that are awarded to a Medal of Honor recipient, even if they're deceased. The family members get benefits, the automatic admission to the military academies, a list so long I really couldn't include it all. And the Pentagon said no. That Medal of Honor. Remember, I said about the name being inscripted on the back. The Pentagon stood by their guns, rightfully so. This award was given to the Vietnam unknown. Michael Blassie is no longer the Vietnam unknown, so he does not get to keep the Medal of Honor. And I support the Pentagon. I think that was the right decision. So now the crypt for the Vietnam unknown is empty, and it is inscribed. And I apologize, because the best picture I could find: honoring and keeping faith with America's missing servicemen from 1958 to 1975. That means there will never be another unknown soldier. People, when you join the military now, they take DNA samples. As long as they can find something, they will be able to identify you. So fortunately, the tomb guards will no longer have to welcome other comrades to the plaza. So we'll talk about the sarcophagus a little bit. Remember, I mentioned this is actually the front of the sarcophagus. It's the largest piece of solid sculptured marble in the world. It weighs 78 tons. It's 11 feet tall, 8 feet wide, 13 feet long. There's 4 parts to it. We have the sub base, which is the part that's even with the ground here. So the sub base is this area down here. The base is from this edge right here down to here. The die is the area that's actually sculpted right here. And then the cap, or the capstone. It was emplaced in 1931, and I have some pictures. I've seen pictures of it, and it's an amazing feat of engineering to take a 78-ton piece of marble and place it down exactly where it needs to be. It was designed by Lorimer Rich and sculpted by Thomas Hudson Jones. So the symbolism around all of this: on the front of the tomb are 3 figures: peace, victory, and valor. The symbol, and they're all joining hands. The symbolism here is that peace is attained through victory, and victory is attained through valor. On each side, and on the other side here, there are 3 wreaths, 6 wreaths in total on each. 3 wreaths on each side, 6 wreaths in total. 1 for each of the major campaigns that the American Expeditionary Forces fought in: the Ardennes, Bella Wood, Chateau Thierry, Meuse-Argonne, Auvis-Oiseau, and the Somme. Now, this is, as I've mentioned or alluded to, this is the reverse of the tomb. This is actually the back. This is where the sentinel walks. And this is that famous quote that everybody pretty much knows who's been there. Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God. And ironically, we don't know who wrote that. There are tombstones of unknowns predating this unknown that have that inscription or something similar, and nobody knows who came up with it. So I always found it ironic but fitting that the epitaph of the unknown is written by somebody who is also unknown. So the crypts without a sarcophagus, and I pointed out at the beginning, the Korean War, Vietnam, and World War II, are just slabs that are at ground level. And the reason, and this was a cause of why it took so long to inter the World War II and Korean unknowns. There was a lot of infighting, and from what I've read, it was quite bitter about how to mark and honor future unknowns after the First World War. And there was a contingent of people who wanted to have a sarcophagus over each of the graves. And there was a contingent, so there's kind of big monumental kind of things. And there were people who were against that because, and this may sound terrible, but, it could get very crowded up there. If we have enough wars and enough unknowns, it could get, what are you going to do if it literally fills up there? And so the final solution was to just inter future unknowns at ground level and keep the view simple, clean, and reverent. And I think that's probably I think that's probably one of the best solutions to this. So we'll talk about the Sentinels. That's pretty much everything on the unknowns, unless Gloria, if you had a question or something, or even Linda, if you had a question. I'm going to take a drink here while I wait for you to ask me a question.
You have answered all of them.
I
Good.
had a well.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wish I had this before I went. I'll go again. It's just
Okay.
a lot of information. Very good. I'm
Good.
really enjoying it. I want to know about, you said there are so many thousands of wreaths ceremonies a
Yeah.
year. You mentioned that. And then you said, I was trying to write down things. You said about now World War I, there were 17. You had a lot of sets of unknowns. These are just remains. Are we talking just body parts? Are we talking one body? I didn't get
We're
that.
talking one grave. I don't know. I would imagine. I do know there are mass graves where if they only have pieces of bodies, they will put them all in one casket and put 20. Like there's several in Arlington Cemetery that they say 28 unknown remains kind of thing.
Oh, they have. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
they have.
Graves there's a couple. I don't remember the exact number, but I do know there's some mass graves. There's a Civil War that has 1,600 sets of remains.
Wow.
That they just had little pieces. So it's we'll talk about the wreath ceremonies in much detail.
Okay, then I'll wait.
I just need to take a drink for a minute. So
I have a lot of questions.
Take your
that's
time.
fine.
No, we're just
okay.
I'm just listening. Okay,
that's good.
Go. Okay.
Well, so we'll talk about the Sentinels now. So why do we guard the unknowns? And this is a very sad story. And I use this picture because it demonstrates, remember I mentioned that, the First World War unknown was interred in 1921, but the sarcophagus was not put in until 1931. So I know this picture is somewhere in that time period, and I'll talk about why I know these dates. But this demonstrates why we actually have to have a guard. So there are a lot of cultures even today, but back then our culture, people would go to the cemetery on big day, like anniversaries, birthdays, even anniversaries of death. And they would have like a little picnic and a party right there on the grave, right at the grave, so that they could feel like their loved one was contributing in a part of the thing. Well, now remember I mentioned there's 17,000 unknowns. And there were people who were coming to Arlington Cemetery and they were literally doing picnic lunches on top of the unknown's grave. There were photographers who you could stand on top of the grave and get your picture taken for $5 or something like that. And a lot of veterans groups and Gold Star Mother groups were just apoplectic. They were infuriated, and people acted a fool. There was no respect at all, and they demanded a guard be placed to ensure that people treated the gravesite with respect. And of course, again, that was the Department of War before it became the Pentagon. But of course, they're going to fight it. They argued that we don't have any place to billet a guard detail. We don't have the money. We're just drawn down from World War I, blah, blah, blah. Then, but they finally, there was a scathing article in the Washington Post about how terrible people were acting at the tomb and disrespectful. And they finally shamed the War Department into posting a civilian guard initially, and then later on an armed military guard. Now, let me go back here. And so that's sort of the derivation of why we are guarding the unknowns. And it's unfortunate. You still, I mean, it's a recurring, it's not a lot. You might get one, person being disrespectful in the course of a day, but when there's thousands of people, I guess that's what's going to happen. So that's why we guard them. So the mission of the Sentinels is that they are responsible for maintaining the highest standards and traditions of the United States Army and this nation, while keeping a constant vigil at this national shrine, and to prevent any desecration or disrespect towards the tomb. And they do it very, very well. They take their job very, very seriously. It is why the standards are so high. We represent the American people, remembering the unknowns. So we'll talk about the history for a little bit. Like I mentioned, 1925, civilian guards were added while the cemetery was open. Then they finally put together a military guard that was armed, and that was the source of that picture in 1926. And the Army oversees Arlington Cemetery, so that's why the Army is in charge of it. And again, this is one of those, my opinion, for what it's worth, I think it should be joint service guarding the unknowns, just for the fact that the Vietnam unknown was Air Force. The other unknowns, they could be Navy, they could be Marines, they could be whatever, Coast Guard. So but that being said, they don't, nobody gets too excited about my opinion. So in 1937, the U.S. Army began guarding the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier 24/7, 365. Since July 2nd, and put that date back in the back of your mind, because you're going to hear it again a little later. Since then, over 85 years, there has been an American soldier on that plaza 24/7, remembering and honoring the unknowns and their sacrifice. I mean, that's just really mind blowing right there. The amount of time that's been involved here. In 1948, the 3rd U.S. Infantry, the Old Guard, assumed duties for the guard duty. They assumed duties of representing the Department of the Army at all official ceremonies in Washington, D.C., and consequently became responsible for guarding the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And it is an infantry unit. Now, that'll come back too. So when you volunteer to be a Sentinel, you're given a packet of information. You're taught, and I'll talk about this in much greater detail, but the very first thing you are tasked with doing is learning the Sentinel's Creed. And this is what drives the Sentinels. This is our mission statement in a way that we can understand and we can execute. In fact, and it's not just something you do. When I was the assistant relief commander, before we posted our first Sentinel from our squad, our relief, before we posted them in the morning, we would all stand at attention and recite the Sentinel's Creed together. And I did that because I had they were 18, 20, 22-year-old kids. I wanted them laser focused on their mission for the day. This is what you're doing today, nothing else. Okay. And so I'll read this to you and talk a little bit about it. It's the Sentinel's Creed. My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted. In the responsibility bestowed on me, never will I falter. And with dignity and perseverance, my standard will remain perfection. Through the years of diligence and praise and the discomfort of the elements, I will walk my tour in humble reverence to the best of my ability. It is he who commands the respect I protect, his bravery that made us so proud. Surrounded by well-meaning crowds by day, alone in the thoughtful peace of night, this soldier will, in honored glory, rest under my eternal vigilance.
Mhm.
Hua, that's Hua, as we said in the Army. So the one thing we always take away from this is what we call line 6. Now it's line 6 because I can't format this the way the actual creed is written out. So this is line 1, line 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Line 6, my standard will remain perfection. Now, obviously, that's an unachievable standard, but it's something that you strive for. And if a sentinel makes a mistake, either by omission or commission, you don't have to yell at them. You just say, hey, line 6, sentinel, line 6, tomb guard, get it together. You're not doing this. Okay. And that's all it takes. Just line 6, my standard will remain perfection. And again, that's because we represent the American people and they deserve the absolute best of what we can give. So we'll talk about walking the mat. Now, the sentinel is not marching. Okay. Marching is done at a cadence of 120 beats per minute, 2 per second. Okay. The sentinels walk on the mat, and they do this as a matter of reverence and memoriam and a solemnity in the situation. So they're walk. We refer to it as a walk. I think it was 350 walks. So the sentinel starts at one end of the mat and he walks down the mat 21 steps. 21. Everything is based on 21 for a 21 gun salute, the highest honor that a military person can receive. 21 steps down the mat, and he stops and he faces towards the east, and he waits 21 seconds. How does he know when 21 seconds is up? Well, you count to yourself. Everybody had slightly different techniques. One guy had a poem, one guy had a song that I knew. I would count to 30 because 30 at the cadence that I walked down the mat was 21 seconds. After 21 seconds, the sentinel will face back down the mat and he will change shoulders with the weapon. The sentinel always carries the weapon on the shoulder towards the crowd, symbolic of keeping intruders out. That's the manual of arms that the sentinels practice in front of the mirror. Just going left shoulder. You will have done that thousands of times before you ever get out here on the plaza in front of people. Again, he'll wait 21 seconds and he'll step off and take 21 steps. The sentinel is carrying a fully operational M14A1 rifle. It weighs about 11 to 12 pounds. The stock is wooden and it's shaved down, so it's hard to get an exact weight on it. With a fixed bayonet, the sentinel will take 21 steps, stop, face towards DC, wait 21 seconds, and he'll repeat that until the relief commander and the sentinel relieving him come out to relieve him from duty. So we'll talk about the changing of the guard. It takes 7.5 minutes to do the changing of the guard, and so I just don't have time to run a video of the whole thing. So I'm just going to hit the highlights. You can go out there to YouTube and do changing the guard, and you'll get about 100 hits on it. During the summer, while the cemetery is open, from April 1st to September 30th, the guard changes every 30 minutes. It's not because it's hot and they get tired. It's because there's so many tourists coming in. They want to give everybody an opportunity to see the changing the guard and keep the tourists moving through the cemetery. And the cemetery is open from 8 in the morning till 7 at night. So there's 25 guard changes that are there for people to see. In the wintertime, the crowds aren't quite as big, so it's a 1-hour shift. The cemetery is open from 8 to 5. When the cemetery is closed, and that's generally at night, but they have closed it due to weather. They did close it during COVID. The post it's a 2-hour post. It becomes more of a real Army guard post. During those 2 hours at night, we do use the plaza to train new sentinels. They do it with respect, but you can't reach that kind of perfection unless you're on the ground. You can wear a seasonal uniform. The dress blues are a really sharp looking uniform, one of the sharpest. They do not keep you cool in the summer, and they definitely do not keep you warm in the winter. So you can wear more so, you might have to wear some earmuffs or something at night. And at night, there's no inspection of the weapon or the uniform because it's dark. You can't see. The plaza is illuminated, but where the inspection happens is dark. So the inspection occurs down in the quarters. So, and we'll elaborate here a little bit on the weapons inspection. The inspection for the weapon does not happen if it's raining. So if the sentinel's wearing a raincoat, they will not inspect the weapon. That's because a wet weapon cannot pass the inspection, so there's no sense in doing it. Also at night, like I mentioned, because it's dark. The uniform inspection at night is done downstairs. During the day, it's done all the time to check his uniform. And if there's something wrong, you will send the relief commander will send them downstairs. I unfortunately had to send a couple guys downstairs that had a little thing wrong with their uniform. And no, you're not going on post like that. You know, get downstairs and fix it. And they weren't happy about that. But I like to show this slide because I like to show this sidearm. It is a M17 6 Hour 9mm. In 2017, 6 Hour was contracted to provide sidearms for all the U.S. military. And as part of that, they designed a special 9mm, specially made 9mm pistol for use specifically at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. They made 4 of them, one for the Sergeant of Guard, one for each of the relief commanders. It is, if you have any appreciation for weapons as a work of art or gunsmithing, please Google this because it is an amazing work of art. I will just show you some highlights here. I have a slide, but it just took too long, so I really had to gloss over it. A couple of things I'll point out here. Where'd that go? You can see right here on where the slide, where you grab the slide to pull it back, there's XXI. That's Roman numerals for 21 gun salute. Normally, the magazine carries 15 rounds, and it will be flush with the bottom of the pistol grip. This one protrudes because it's designed to carry 21 rounds. And it goes on and on and on. In the front sight, there's a small vial of marble taken from the sarcophagus. You know, they just went crazy. It was just amazing what they did in the development of this weapon. So, I would recommend doing that. It's fascinating. So saluting the unknowns. During the guard change, the sentinels come to the middle. Here, this is the off-going sentinel. This is the oncoming sentinel and the relief commander. They come to the middle. The relief commander has them face towards the tomb and go to present arms. They're saluting the unknown. So why do they do this? Remember, I mentioned that all of the unknowns have been awarded the Medal of Honor. Well, the protocol in the military is that anybody who is awarded the Medal of Honor, they will salute the flag, the national anthem, the president. That's it. Everybody else salutes them. So this is the sentinels rendering honors to the unknowns for receiving their medal, for having been awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, and the reason you do it here is that that way the sentinel doesn't have to salute every time he walks past them. You know, so it's just at the beginning of the shift and the end of the shift, and that covers everything. The other thing, and I threw this in because before I was a sentinel, and when I was in DC, I lived in DC for a while before I joined the Army. I would go down there, and I really couldn't figure out this part of the guard change. So once they salute the unknowns, the relief commander has them face each other and go to port arms. This is port arms. And the relief commander will tell the offgoing sentinel, pass on your orders. Okay. The oncoming sentinel will say, orders acknowledged. I'm sorry. The oncoming sentinel will, the offgoing sentinel will say, post and orders remain as directed. And what that means is, as part of your orders, your instructions, your standing orders of what you're supposed to do, they define your post. Okay, so the post is basically everything on the plaza. Now, if something happens down here on this sidewalk or down here on this road, that's not on my post, and I don't care. I'm not worried about it. But something happens over here, I'm all over it. Okay, so you define the post and your orders. The sentinels have special orders that direct them how to handle any situation that may occur on post. Okay, and so what the offcoming sentinel is saying is post and orders remain as directed. There's no changes. Your post is the same. Your standing orders, your special orders are the same. This sentinel replies with orders acknowledged. And at that point, he is responsible for guarding the unknowns. Okay, So that's what that whole exchange is about. And sometimes it's kind of hard to understand what they're saying, but it's crucial to what goes on out there. So the requirements to become a sentinel, it's all volunteer. You can't make somebody do this. It is what the Army, it's in Army jargon, not MOS non-specific. You can be, MOS is military occupational specialty. Like I was an infantryman, that's 11 Bravo. Cooks I think are 87 kilos. Every job in the Army has a name to it. It has a numeric alphabet, alphanumeric designator to it. Basically, any job, you can be a cook, you can be a medic, you can be a helicopter mechanic, a chaplain's aide. Anybody can be a sentinel at the Tomb of the Unknown. Anybody who meets the other requirements. You must be 5'10" to 6'4" with a slender build. Now, women are allowed to be sentinels, and that's why this occurred in the late, well, actually, right after I was my second tour of the Old Guard. The Army did a study, or the military did a study on what jobs women could do that traditionally have been always done by men. And what we heard was that the very first job at the top of that list was Sentinel, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So the Army was directed to incorporate women into the Sentinel ranks. Now, the problem with that is, remember I mentioned the Old Guard is an infantry unit. Well, infantry is combat arms. Women weren't allowed to serve in combat arms. So they had to come up with a way to get a female in the Army attached to an infantry unit. And they jumped through a lot of hoops and they figured some things out. They've got it all figured out now. But as part of that process, because they had to open it up to all MOSs for women, well, now they had to open it up to all MOSs for men, because you can't say, okay, men, you have to be infantry, and women, you can be anything you want to be. So they had to open it up to everyone, which I think is fine. I'm good with all of that. So that's why it's MOS non-specific. You must be of sound character. You must be able to get a top secret special background investigation clearance. While you're there, your standard behavior has to be beyond reproach. My first roommate bounced a check at the PX, and when he was on a different relief. So, and when I came home, he was gone. Bag and baggage gone that day. So they don't mess around. And several sentinels that I know were relieved of duty for some of it was on duty performance, some of it was off duty. You know, you met line 6, right? Line 6. So the organization, I've alluded to this a little bit, is a sergeant of the guard, a sergeant first class, and we just recently had the first female sergeant of the guard. Up until a year ago, I could refer to the sergeant of the guard as he. But now I kind of catch myself having to use a gender non-specific. So the sergeant of the guard is a sergeant first class and is in charge of all the sentinels. The place you would see the sergeant of the guard most often is when there's a presidential wreath ceremony, when Biden goes there, when Trump would go there. The sergeant of the guard acts as the wreath bearer for them, and you'll see a little bit more of that. An assistant sergeant of the guard, usually an E6, sometimes an E5, is primarily responsible for training newly assigned sentinels during their 2 weeks of initial training. And then there's 3 reliefs, 3 squads of soldiers with an authorized strength of 7 soldiers, 3, 7, 21, 21 for a 21 gun salute. Everything's 21 down there. Each relief, each squad is authorized a staff sergeant as the relief commander, a sergeant as the assistant relief commander, and 5 sentinels. Now, I say authorized strength because at any given time, you might only have 3 sentinels. It's all volunteer. If nobody volunteers and meets, and you have sentinels that are getting out of the Army or getting orders to go to other units and stuff because their tour is up, you're just going to be shorthanded. Conversely, you could have 7 sentinels because you might have a couple sentinels that are programmed to leave, and it takes 6 months to train a sentinel. So you've got to get some overlap here, get some new folks in there to take over as they leave. So that's the authorized strength. But there was one relief when I was there, only had 4 soldiers on it. And then my relief, I think we had 7, and we were lucky. We were at full strength, which was rare. So the training that you go through once you volunteer to be a sentinel You do 2 weeks of temporary duty where that assistant sergeant of the guard trains you. They teach you how to prep your uniform, the standards for your uniform, and the standards for the weapons manual. You will in no way be able to meet the standards in that 2-week period, but you're taught what the standards are and how to achieve them. And that's where you're given the Sentinel's Creed and other information to memorize. At the end of the 2 weeks, you are given a test, and the main thing they're looking for is ability and desire. Are you capable of meeting these standards, and do you want to meet these standards? And if you meet those and you show promise, you show that you want to do this, then you are actually assigned to a relief, and you're assigned by height. So I'm 5'10", I was on 3rd relief. The reason we do it that way, remember I said the height requirements were 5'10" to 6'4". Well, I'm 5'10", somebody 6'4" is going to be way up here, and that's going to look all lopsided on the plaza. So you're assigned by height so that there's more uniformity among the sentinels on post. So first relief was the tall guys, the 6'2" to 6'4". Second relief was 6 feet to 6'2", and third relief was 5'10" to 6 feet. There is a waiver available for women because most women aren't even 5'10", so there's a waiver available for that. Once you're assigned to a relief, this is where you start doing that mirror time I talked about. You literally just stand in front of that mirror and go left shoulder to right shoulder to left shoulder, present arms until you have to help the sentinel get dressed to go outside. Then you're going to do a cleaning of the quarters and a policing up of the quarters. Then you're going to get right back in front of that mirror. You're going to learn the guard changes. That's done on night hours a little bit. That's done as I alluded to, a private area that isn't open to the public in the cemetery. And you also learn how to do wreath ceremonies. Once you've gotten to a point of proficiency, you're given 3 different tests. First is a uniform inspection. There are no gigs. And when I say a gig, I mean that no faults. If a measurement is supposed to be 1 inch, if my brass is supposed to be 1 inch from my collar and it's 31-30 seconds, that's a gig. 0 gigs zero tolerance on this. A practical exam, the sergeant of guard and the relief commander go out and they observe you walking the mat and doing a wreath ceremony, and they grade you on it. And then there's a written exam. And this is where, again, I'm going to voice my opinion, not that anybody cares. The written exam, when I was there, it was 100 questions, fill in the blank. It was tough. You had to know a lot of stuff. It was 100 questions out of a 200 question battery. Now the test is they give you 18 pieces of blank paper and you have to handwrite all of your cemetery information. It has to be perfect. It has to be spelling counts, punctuation counts. And I think that's a little excessive, but I'm just saying. So it takes about 6 to 9 months to meet these standards to become a tomb guard. And about 60% of the individuals who volunteer make it. The ones who quit, the 40%, most of them quit the first day. They get down there and realize this is a lot of work. This is hard stuff. And they'll quit the first day. Some of it is because they either maybe they messed up and got relieved, whatever. Once you get to this point, this is where you are awarded the Guard Tomb of the Unknown Soldier Identification Badge. And here I'm going to answer Linda's question about what is the Guard Tomb of the Unknown Soldier Identification Badge. This is a representation of, this is a picture of the badge. This is the front relief of the tomb with the words Honor Guard and an inverted wreath, identical to the ones on the side of the tomb. It's inverted as a sign of mourning. There have been 702 of these awarded since 1958. That's about 11 or 12 a year. It is the 3rd least awarded decoration in the military. The first one, and I always kind of make a little fun of this, is the Army astronaut badge. I didn't know the Army had astronauts, and I don't know why they need to get a badge, but they do, and they haven't given out as many as they have to tomb guards. So that's one. The other award is to the caisson platoon in the old guard that does the caissons. They have created their sort of an equivalent to the tomb guard identification badge. They call it the expert equestrian badge, and there are certain very similar standards here. And they can earn it. But that award's only been around, I think it's 4 years. They've handed out like 20 or 30 of them. So that doesn't really count. There, as I mentioned, women are allowed to do this job. There have been 5 women awarded the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier Identification Badge. 3 Sentinels have been killed in action, 2 in Vietnam, 1 in Afghanistan. And we've actually awarded the Unknowns badge number 175 because we figure they're out there more than all of us. So they deserve a badge. So it's more of an honorarium. So a day in a life. We'll talk about what the Sentinel goes through. Uniform prep. It takes so you can see all this brass and everything on this is me standing the mat. All the brass, all these buttons, all this brass comes off and has to be shined. The uniform has to be steam pressed. There are steam presses in the quarters that we use. They don't go to the cleaners. You don't want to send your uniform to the cleaners because they ruin them. They mess up all your creases and all the stuff you're supposed to have. The brass all comes off and gets shined. That's about an hour. The uniform gets steam pressed. That takes about an hour also. The shoes, and I'll talk about it in a little more detail. The shoes are actually spit shine. Even spit shine is a misnomer. And it would take about an hour shining each shoe. So that's about 2 hours. Now that was when I had met the standard. That was just upkeeping my uniform. When I was new and working on getting my uniform to standards, I would spend 6 to 8 hours. Now, this is not why you're at work. This is your time. You show up to work with your uniform ready to go to work. You don't show up for work to prep your uniform. Uniform prep is your time, not the Army's time. So it's a very demanding schedule. The relief shifts, and I skipped over that. I apologize. The relief shifts, so eventually there's 3 reliefs. Each relief works a 12-hour shift. I'm sorry. Yeah. No, I'm sorry. They recently changed, so I got to get this straight here. They work a 24-hour shift, and then they're down 24 hours and a 24-hour shift. So they work a day, off a day. They do that 3 times, and then they're off for 3 days, and they just rotate through that. So you work three shifts, and then you're off. Walks per day. Remember, I mentioned that during the summer you have 24 guard changes. In the wintertime, you only have 8. So the number of walks per day is a function of how long the cemetery is open and how many sentinels you have walking. So in the summertime, if you only have 3 sentinels walking, you're getting 8, 9 walks. If in the wintertime you've got 6 or 7 sentinels walking and there's only 8 shifts, you're going to get 1. So it really, there's no way to kind of codify this into a single number. Tour of duty is 2 years. You have to have 2 years retainability to be a sentinel. So you might have to extend your enlistment or re-enlist in order to stay a sentinel, but you stay there for 2 years unless you get relieved. So remember, I mentioned that they steam press the pants. They have actual steam presses in the quarters. We talked about spit shining. It's actually, and I'll tell you the secret. It's the secret is that there's no spit involved. You take a 100% cotton handkerchief, wet it down, and wring it out as best you can so it's just damp. Then you squirt lighter fluid in the polish, and then you use that handkerchief to spread the polish, and you do that for an hour until it's nice and shiny. Because the belt that the sentinel wears is tight and it holds the whole uniform in place, the sentinel cannot dress himself. So here you can see a sentinel taking the excess material and grabbing it and pulling it under while the sentinel going on post tightens up that belt, and that's where all the excess material gets stuck down in there. So you can't dress yourself while you're doing this. And we call this the ready rack. And you see here's the white gloves, and I don't know if you've seen the email. Yes, they do spray the gloves with water. It helps keep because they're cotton, and that weapon is very, very slick. And if your gloves are too slick, you'll drop the weapon and you're done. So you spray water on them. The sunglasses are, because remember I mentioned that's marble. It's white marble. If you didn't wear sunglasses out there, you would get a version of snow blindness from all the white reflecting snow or white reflecting marble. So here's the wreath laying ceremonies. Like I mentioned, there's 2,000, and they range from little elementary school kids. And in May, May is just a brutal month down there because that's when all the schools make their trips to DC.
Hmm.
And there were days that we would have 7 and 8 wreath ceremonies in a day. Just wreaths, all the way from elementary school kids up to presidents of the United States. So it's a huge conglomeration. Now during COVID, the cemetery was closed. There were no wreath ceremonies, but any organization that's not subversive, so like we won't let Al Qaeda, lay a wreath at the tomb, but anybody else, any American sporting organization, whether it's a school or a church choir or whatever, can petition, and you can go through the House of Representatives, you represent the House of Representatives, or you can contact the military district of Washington, and they'll get you set up with that. But I always like to point out, and this one is one of those other things that gives me goosebumps. The most important wreath ceremony is Christmas Day. The unknown, Christmas is a family day. The unknowns have no family. The sentinels were their family. And so there is a mandatory formation. Every sentinel assigned to the tomb of the unknown soldier must report for duty on Christmas Day, and we lay wreaths on the unknown's graves. That's kind of our version of a Christmas present. And what I find very touching is, so these are just the sentinels who are assigned, but the sentinels who are actually going to present the wreaths, it's the senior assigned sentinel. So it doesn't matter if he's a private. If he's been there longer than everybody else, he's the senior sentinel. And the junior sentinel, the one who's been assigned there the shortest amount of time, are the wreath presenters. And it's very, very touching. And it's something that we feel honored to participate in. So and actually the cemetery is open Christmas Day. So if you could actually go witness this if you care to. So we're coming down to the end here. Can the sentinel speak? Absolutely. This is a real Army Guard post. And if you violate the sentinel's orders, he will challenge you. The sentinel will challenge you. Remember, I showed it at port arms. The sentinel will go to port arms and say, halt, it is requested that visitors maintain a mature and reverent attitude while in the vicinity of the tomb. Or, it's requested, it was requested that visitors remain silent while in the vicinity of the tomb. There's several pat challenges that they have. The big one is somebody coming under the chains, coming under the railings, and it's halt. It's requested visitors remain on the outside of the railings. But everything is all part of your training. You know exactly what to do. Has anyone tried to deface the tomb? Not that I'm aware of, and I would be aware probably. There have been several incidents of people, it's somewhere between harassing and assaulting. Nobody's actually assaulted a sentinel, but there have been people who have, in fact, I was looking up a word, menace, where people have come in and approached the sentinel, come on post and approach the sentinel has warded them off. Is the weapon loaded? All security measures at the tomb of the unknown soldier, and that's why I can't tell you some things about how they would handle certain situations. Like if you challenge an intruder, so what's the next step? I can't tell you because we got to keep that confidential. Is the weapon loaded? All security measures at the tomb of the unknown soldier are classified. And so I am not permitted to discuss that. When is the tomb not guarded? We talked about this. It's guarded 24/7, 365. Always, no matter what, day, night, rain or shine. If you recall, there were some things a couple of years ago where there was a hurricane. And there was rumors that the commanding general ordered the tomb guards to stand down, and they refused. That's nonsense. They are soldiers, and if they were ordered to stand down, they would have. What really happened was the commanding general authorized them to abandon their posts if it was too dangerous to stay there. But they took great measures to make sure they were safe, and they were not going to abandon their post. Couple of websites, Old Guard websites, Side of the Honor Guard. Arlington Cemetery is a great website with lots of detail. That was what I got to look at every morning when I was working. I'm getting a warning, my internet is unstable. Okay. That concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to spend some time with you.
Golly.
Yeah, that was great. It was, oh my goodness. I wish I had this information before I went, but I'll go back to Washington
Okay,
DC with
you
a
go back.
new set of eyes. And
Okay.
just, it was just really great. This will
I
be
was a little
recorded.
rusty. It's been a couple months since I've given it. That's why I was stumbling a little
But
bit.
this,
I actually practiced a little bit, and I apologize for kind of losing my train of thought there a
no,
little
I
bit.
followed you very well. But with all the stuff you have to do, and this is a volunteer
Mhm.
position, why would, I mean, are you ever lacking for people to come forward to do
Yes,
this?
there is. There's a serious shortage of people. I think I did it for the honor. When I was in fifth or sixth grade, my dad took me to Washington for us to do a father-son tour around, and he took me to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and I was just
Oh, I think he froze.
joined the army, and they like,
Uh,
well, what do you want to do? And I went, oh, I want to be a sentinel at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So,
oh,
it's but you do inspire people from the units that will come in and volunteer to do it. So they do spend they do try to recruit folks. Um,
mhm.
I know but because keeping the mission going is a manpower or a person power thing. So yeah, but it's not for the faint of heart. It takes a tremendous amount of dedication. You have to be part of this is you have to be there for the right reason. If
Yeah.
you're there because you just want to go out in front of the tourists and march up and down and look pretty and get your picture taken, you're not going to last. You're not going to make it through that. But if you're there to truly honor the unknowns and remember them, it's a piece of cake. I would have days I would walk out of that quarters, we were done for the day, and I would just be exhausted and fed up from I've been going for 24, 25 hours, hadn't had any sleep. Now I got to go clean the latrine at the barracks up at Fort Myer. And I would walk out there, and before the cemetery was open, I would just look at the unknowns and go, you're just being a wimp.
Um,
And
well,
so it was very motivating for me.
I guess you will. It's a personal thing. I Now what happens now when you come on duty and start walking the mat? The walk. How long do you have to do that for? 30 minutes?
Well, like it's by the shifts. So if it's summertime, yeah, it's a 30-minute shift. But remember, it takes 7 minutes to do a guard change. So you're only actually walking the mat for 13 minutes. Well, no, I
Okay.
guess you would, yeah, no, I guess it would be the whole 30 because
Oh,
when they're inspecting the other sentinel, you're still walking the mat. Yeah. So and then in the wintertime, it's an hour. And that M14 gets heavy at about 45 minutes. 30 minutes, piece of cake. You can just stand on your head. But about 45, 50 minutes, that 12-pound M14, your arm starts getting a little crampy and a little worn
uh-huh.
out.
Yeah. So you do that for 30 minutes and then you take a break. Not take a break, but it's over. And then you go out the same day and do another 30 minutes.
Right. So well, it depends
Uh-huh.
on how many. If you only have three sentinels, so you're up, and then the next sentinel comes out, and the next one. So in another hour, you're going back out. Okay. Now, if you
Okay.
have 6 or 7 sentinels, you'll get a 2.5 hour break, to where depending on how the rotation, how many people are actually. It's called the rotation. How they rotate the
Mhm.
sentinels on and off post. So it depends on how many you have. And if you got somebody out sick, if you got somebody on leave, you
Yeah.
might have 5 sentinels, but you might only have 2 or 3 working that day. Or a couple of times they had 2 sentinels. We call them back to back. You're just taking turns, jumping out there, guarding, and coming back. So it
Wow.
can get and that can get bad when it's.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to stop the recording here. But
Okay.
you don't have to leave. You'll probably be back.
Okay.